Okay, short word of warning before we start. The script for this I wrote for several months, uh, sort of as a stream of consciousness while I was working on it. So, while I was visiting a friend, I had brought some homebrewed mead I made a while back. The two meads I brought was made through a fairly simple process of brewing followed by back sweetening. For those who don't know, back sweetening is a process where you infuse flavor into the mead by having things like spices or fruits just laying in the container for a certain amount of time. Long story short, he enjoyed them and issued me a challenge. He gave me 2 bags of something called Chinese yeast balls and challenged me to brew something using that as the yeast. The same day I found out kveik is finally available for purchase where I live without me having to pay international import fees, so I figured an experiment is in order. You see, the yeast you use for brewing will impact the end product of the brew you're making in the form of flavor. The experiment then is about what kind of impact these yeasts will have on the finished product. We know quite a bit about kveik. The strain I'm using is bought from a Norwegian brewer's website and has an alcohol tolerance of about 12%. Prefers brewing temperatures in the realm of 35 to 40 Celsius and adds notes of orange to a brew, at least when brewing a beer. The Chinese yeast ball, however, is quite a mystery. What I found from doing some Googling is that these yeast balls contain a mold and a yeast who work in tandem when making a type of rice wine. I have no idea how it will impact taste. I don't know what the alcohol tolerance is. From what I found online, it might have a tolerance in the region of 10 to 15%. We won't know until the experiment is done. So here's the methodology I'm using. I'm going to make a batch of roughly 4 liters of honey water. The recipe I'm using is actually a recipe for 20 liters of a base, so I have scaled it down significantly. For 4 liters I need approximately 1.8 kilograms of honey and 2.8 liters of water. This batch will be evenly split between 2 different containers, so the only variable when it comes to taste is the yeast itself. Of those 2 smaller batches of 2 liters, I will keep some of the pure mead and back sweeten the rest, since I'm much more a fan of less sweet and more fresh and mildly acidic flavors. Now, I can't afford high quality honey, so I'm using fairly waxy honey. To make it easier for myself, I heat up half the water and add the honey to the water, stirring it around until it's fully dissolved. I don't want the water to be boiling, but it needs to be warm enough to make the process fast enough. It would be preferable to not spend 1 to 2 hours stirring honey water after all. To lower the temperature, the last half of the water is cold. Before we add yeast, I measure the gravity. The reading tells us original gravity is about 1.100, which might be a bit high since the water is still somewhat warm. I will be keeping to this reading though, since I'm adding a lot of yeast nutrition as well to start, so the yeast has something to kickstart it. Some improvisation was done with the containers for the brewing. I only have one proper brewing vessel, which can take up to about 25 liters of liquid. That's very much overkill for something this small, so instead I bought 2 cans. For the screw corks on the cans, I got some help from my father to drill a hole and put in some rubber stoppers, turning these simple 5-liter cans into small batch brewing vessels. They're only partially opaque, which will also let me inspect the process closer. Day 1 is when I started the actual brewing and added yeast. The brewing itself was interesting. It didn't take long for the kveik to get going. It was bubbling away just fine, maybe a bit more aggressive than I'm used to. No worries there. The Chinese yeast, on the other hand, about an hour, maybe an hour and a half after I added the yeast, the brew using the Chinese yeast was starting to get noticeably darker. Maybe it's because of the residue from the mortar, but that amount ought to be completely negligible. English is a language. Day 2 is when things really started to get interesting. After I got home from work, I decided to test the smell of each. The kveik batch greeted me with a smell so potent it felt like napalm was burning in my nostrils. Needless to say, this is very promising indeed. The Chinese yeast had not started fermenting whatsoever, but it had gone even blacker for some reason. There was also barely any smell whatsoever. I did some shaking of both containers to relieve the mixtures of CO2, and that's when I realized the Chinese yeast hadn't even started incorporating into the honey water, which the kveik had already done. After doing some Google Translate online, I found that the Chinese yeast ball, depending on the variety, might need several days before it actually starts fermenting. So I left it and decided to check it again the next day. The next thing to happen was the kveik hitting the target gravity of 1.03. This means the APV alcohol content is roughly in the realm of 10%. I decided to stop the fermentation there for the kveik, while the Chinese yeast hadn't started to ferment yet. That batch didn't start to ferment until one more day had passed. During the next few days, the Chinese batch started to brighten up to a proper mead colour, and it finally started brewing. The first measurement I did after it had started brewing showed a gravity of 1.072, which translates to an APV of about 4.5%. At this point, the kveik batch had been filtered and was in storage. A tiny sample of the kveik batch was simply pure mead, while the rest was back sweetened with Norwegian red currant berries, which are very acidic and somewhat sour in taste, which I figure might be tasty in conjunction with the rounded sweetness of honey. 2 weeks later, I checked the gravity of the Chinese batch, and the gravity was 1.034, giving us an alcohol content of about 9.6%. I figured I'd let it sit a week more, which gives the Chinese batch a final gravity of 1.020, or 11.5 APV. At this point, the Chinese batch also had a proper mead colour, and not this ominous black colour it showed the first week. An issue I faced with the Chinese batch was filtering it. It was a cloudy mess, even after filtering it 6 times. At which point, I taste tested it. Originally, this was planned to be the part where I tested both meads in front of a camera, and that would be it. However, as you do when brewing, I did taste the meads after filtering, just to be sure they were safe to consume. Since the respective filterings were more than a month apart, I wouldn't remember exactly what they tasted like anyway. And this is where I decided to stop this project. Why? Because the Chinese batch was absolutely vile. As soon as it hit my tongue, I was met with a horrid, sour taste that immediately triggered my gag reflex, which then just did not want to leave my mouth. The first thing I did after getting the mead itself out of my mouth was to pick it all up and dump it in the toilet, followed by cleaning the brewing vessel with disinfectant just to be absolutely sure it had no chance of ever contaminating another brew. So, what did we learn from this? Do not use Chinese yeast balls for brewing mead. It will only end in suffering.